Knights of Spain, Warriors of the Sun, Hernando de Soto and the South's Ancient Chiefdoms by Charles Hudson. Chapter 4, Appalachia. De Soto used both a stick and a carrot to keep his expedition moving forward and his men performing their duties. The stick was the very considerable power vested in him as an adelantado and as governor. The carrot was the prospect of riches and ample food supplies farther on, beyond the next river or mountain range. De Soto had ordered Baltasar de Gallegos to send back encouraging news from Uriparacochi, even if he should be disappointed at what he had found. Gallegos obeyed, sending a detachment of 8 horsemen back to De Soto carrying 2 letters, one telling the truth, to be read only by De Soto, and the second, framed in ambiguous but optimistic language, to be read aloud to the men. De Soto explained to his men that the personal letter contained secret information that would be revealed to them in due time, when they would see that what was contained therein was to everyone's advantage. In the letter read aloud to the men, Gallegos promised them nothing specific at Uriparacochi, but hinted at wonderful things that lay ahead. In the letter to his men, Gallegos recounted some of the fabulous stories told him by the Indians of Uriparacochi. They told of the province of Ocale, further on, whose inhabitants kept herds of deer and turkeys in pens, and who could shout at birds flying overhead and cause them to drop from the sky. Ocale was reputed to be a province with traders and with much gold, silver, and pearls. It was a province whose people were at war with the people who lived to the south, where it was summer most of the year. These people to the south were said to possess gold in such abundance that they wore hats that seemed to be helmets of gold. If we are to believe that there was any substance to these stories, the people of the south may have been the Calusa, a non-agricultural chiefdom dominating the coastal area from Charlotte Harbor southward. They are known to have been at war with people around Tampa Bay and perhaps with people further south, and they received gold and silver from Spanish shipwrecks, though their wearing gold hats must be attributed to poor translation, misunderstanding, or falsehood. Gallegos realized these stories were probably false, perhaps a ruse by the people of Uriparacochi to encourage the Spaniards to move on. When Gallegos' letter was read to the men at the base camp, they were moved by a great enthusiasm to march immediately into the interior. When De Soto ordered Captain Pedro Calderon and 40 horsemen and 60 footmen to remain behind to guard the supplies at the base camp and the ships in the harbor, they were crestfallen over not being permitted to go forward with the others. The stories left behind included enough food to last the men stationed at the base camp for 2 years. De Soto ordered Calderon and his men to maintain good relations with the Indians, even if their patience should be tried. De Soto and his men did not find at Tampa Bay the supplies of native food needed to sustain them. Hence, the promise of more ample supplies of corn to the north was an additional incentive to march into the interior. Juan Ortiz had reported that the quality of the land was better in the country of Uriparacochi, and that plenty of corn could be obtained there. As it turned out, the quantities of corn available to De Soto and his men did not in fact increase as they traveled northward from Tampa Bay. But it so happened that they were on the move at the very time the green corn was beginning to ripen, so one cannot be sure that all of the increase can be attributed to increased overall corn production and greater dependence on agriculture by the people. Some of the increase may have been due simply to the progressive ripening of the corn. Departure from Tampa Bay. De Soto announced his decision to move the army forward to Ocale, where he intended to spend the winter. He sent a contingent of horsemen to Uriparacochi to inform Gallegos that he should look for the army to arrive in a specified number of days. On July 15th, De Soto took his leave from Calderon and the 100 or so men who were to remain behind to guard the base camp. Leading a force of about 320 people, De Soto set out toward the east. While on the move, De Soto normally formed his army up into 3 units, a vanguard consisting of horsemen, and sometimes a small number of footmen went in front, clearing the way for the others. De Soto himself usually traveled with the vanguard. Next came the main guard, or battalion, comprising most of the footmen, Indian porters, and servants. A contingent of horsemen traveled with the main guard to protect him. Last came the rear guard of the horsemen to protect the rear and on occasion to prevent any stragglers from defecting or escaping from the expedition. It is likely that the herd of pigs traveled with the main guard, shepherded along by a company of horsemen, according to Garcilaso. Whether De Soto brought along mastiffs to guard the pigs is not known. If not, he might have been able to train one or more of the greyhounds to this task, but doing so would have been hazardous, since greyhounds are chase and attack dogs, and the pigs would have been a constant temptation for them. As they left the base camp, De Soto and his army entered the lower fringe of the vast southeastern pine forest, covering the coastal plain of the eastern Carolinas, southern Georgia, central and southern Alabama, southern Mississippi, and most of Florida. West of the Mississippi, it covered central Louisiana and a small portion of eastern Texas. The southeastern pine forest and all subsequent vegetation zones and landscapes traversed by the De Soto expedition have been profoundly altered during the past 450 years of European occupation, and indeed some changes in the forest have been caused by the Indians. Only fragments of the kinds of forests De Soto and his men explored can be seen today. The landscapes that existed in the 16th century must be reconstructed from historical sources and from various kinds of geological information. To imagine the southeastern landscape as it was in the 16th century, one must begin by taking away some elements and putting back others. Some of what one must take away is obvious: the cities, towns, and highways. One must also take away the dams that impound many southeastern streams, creating large lakes in a region where, except for Florida, there were few natural lakes. And one must take away plants introduced into the southeast from other parts of the world. One must take away bluegrass, plantain, dandelions, honeysuckle, kudzu, and Canadian thistle. One must take away privet and mimosa. One must take away imported animals such as nutria, starlings, and the Norwegian rat. One must put back the animals that are now extinct: the passenger pigeon, whose migratory flights once darkened southern skies, the flocks of boisterous green and yellow Carolina parakeets, the ivory-billed woodpecker, a giant among woodpeckers, who lived in the depths of forests and hammered large, rotting trees to smithereens. One must also vastly extend the range of the animals that are today almost extinct: the sly and furtive panther, master of the lightning attack, and the gregarious wolves, consummate pack animals and clever strategists. Most of all, one must put back the enormous strands of trees that today can only be seen as remnants of the great old-growth forests that were cut down as American farmers moved west. The southeastern pine forest was composed of various mixes of several species of pine trees and broadleaf deciduous trees. In some places, the pines dominated. In other places, the deciduous trees dominated. And in still other places, they were intimately mixed together. But as the name implies, vast areas of the southeastern pine forest were covered with longleaf, loblolly, and slash pine trees, a forest of such monotony that 18th century travelers complained of it. The southeastern pine forest became established during the hypsothermal climatic interval between about 6,000 and 4,000 BC, when prevailing westerly winds made the southeast much hotter and drier than it is today. The climate was so warm and dry, the treeless prairie vegetation of the west crossed over to the eastern side of the Mississippi River, and the forests in the coastal plain became tinderboxes. For thousands of years, they were swept by hot forest fires, mostly started by lightning, that killed off most of the deciduous trees, leaving only pine trees, which would stand fire handily. And these effects were compounded later by an Indian cultural practice. One of the principal ways in which the Indians modified forests was by intentional burning to clear farmland of weeds and brush, to drive game, and perhaps to clear away litter on the forest floor to make way for the tender herbage that would sustain larger numbers of white-tailed deer. The principal deciduous trees in the southeast pine forest are the southern magnolia, ancient of trees, with its large leathery leaves and fragrant white flowers; the sweet gum, with its masses of star-shaped leaves and its fragrant storax gum, valued by Europeans as a medicine and perfume; the white oak, a medium-sized tree with heavy hardwood and sweet acorns, and particularly in the northerly part of the forest; the beech, with strong wood and edible nuts. A minor tree, to which the Spaniards probably initially paid no notice, was the Alpun holly, from whose parched leaves the Indians of the southeast brewed a caffeinated beverage. This tea, called black drink by 18th century Englishmen, was used by the Indians as a sacramental beverage in many social and ritual contexts. The Spaniards may also have paid no notice to cabbage palmetto, but they would soon come to appreciate some of the uses to which it can be put. Because Osita and Mocoso were at war with each other, the territory between their domains, that is, between the Little Manatee and Alafia Rivers, may have been uninhabited. By the end of the first day of travel, the vanguard reached the river of Mocoso, the Alafia River, where they bivouacked. This was probably somewhere between Buckhorn Creek and present-day Bell Shoals Bridge, and perhaps Bell Shoals itself. They built 2 footbridges in order to cross the river. These footbridges were probably no more than tall pine trees stripped of their branches. The Alafia River is about 70 or 80 feet wide at this point. If the crossing was at Bell Shoals, they may have laid one bridge from the near bank to a promontory in the middle of the river, and a second one from the far bank to that same promontory. It is also possible they constructed 2 small footbridges so the army could cross the river more rapidly. They entered Mocoso's territory, the area between Alafia and Hillsborough rivers, but they did not go out of their way to visit his towns because they were situated too far afield from their line of march. On July 16th, they continued on, coming at the end of the day to a place they called the Lake of the Rabbit, probably one of the small lakes near present-day Plant City, Florida. They gave the lake this name because after the horsemen had dismounted near it, leaving their horses untethered, a rabbit suddenly jumped up and frightened all the horses, stampeding them to over a league away. This incident placed the Spaniards in a very dangerous situation because they depended so heavily on their horsemen for military superiority over the Indians. Even if only a few Indians had attacked them at this moment, they could have inflicted much harm. The Spaniards scattered out and retrieved their horses as quickly as they could. They had come to the western edge of the Central Lake District that runs north and south in central Florida. It is a sandhill karst terrain composed of ancient sand dunes supporting a scrub ecosystem with many rare and now endangered plants and animals. These remnant scrub forests are home to the scrub jay, the Florida sandhill crane, the gopher tortoise, and the Florida panther. It has been called a concealed desert because it is covered by vegetation and enjoys ample rainfall. But when it rains in this area, the water drains from the surface very rapidly, leaving virtually no standing water except where there are lakes. On July 17th, they continued on a lake they named St. John's Lake. This could have been any of the lakes near present-day Lakeland, the largest being Lake Parker and Lake Gibson. As they headed out from St. John's Lake the next morning, De Soto and his men again found themselves in a situation that could have been disastrous. As they set out in a northwesterly direction, the country must have looked innocent enough. But the entire day would be spent traveling through a stretch of sandhills and scrub forest. It was very hot, and they found to their discomfort that there was no drinking water to be had. No springs, no creeks, no standing water. One of De Soto's pages, Prado, died of thirst or sunstroke, and others would have died had they not been riding horses. At the end of the day, they arrived, much fatigued, in the probable vicinity of present-day Lumberton. They bivouacked near the upper Withlacoochee River, where they were probably able to obtain water. The next day they came to Squasoco, where they found a large open field with green corn growing in it, the first they report seeing. Squasoco, in the vicinity of present-day Dade City, was probably a town subject to the chief of Uriparcochi. Here they came to the southern edge of the well-drained sandy and loamy soils that lie in Sumter, Marion, and Alachua counties. These desirable agricultural soils lived on the southeastern edge of the Ocala Uplift District, with its diversified low bridges, plains, and swamps. The next day, July 20th, after traveling only a short distance, they came to Luca, a small village probably in the vicinity of present-day Lacuchi. This was near a place where a number of trails evidently crossed each other. De Soto and his men bivouacked at Luca, and Gallegos rode from the main village of Uriparcochi to meet with him. The main town of Uriparcochi was probably located somewhere east of the upper Withlacoochee River, perhaps in present-day Sumter County, where there are soils suitable for native agriculture, but it also could possibly have been in Lake or even Orange County. The following day, Gallegos' contingent of men came to Luca and rejoined the army. De Soto sent a mission summoning Chief Uriparcochi, who was still hiding in one of the large swamps that lay near his principal towns. The chief did not reply. Chief Uriparcochi is surrounded in mystery. None of the Spaniards ever laid eyes on him, and the precise location of his town is unknown. We cannot even be sure of his name or the name of his chiefdom. Uri is Timucuan for war, and Paracusi is chief. So Uriparcochi may simply be a Timucuan title meaning war chief. It does seem clear enough that Paracocchi and his people had access to good agricultural soil, and he clearly dominated the non-agricultural people around Tampa Bay. This is consistent with the hypothesis that practicing agriculture produces enough surplus food to underwrite a military organization that confers an advantage over people who are hunter-gatherers. Hence, the preeminence of Paracocchi would seem to give us some insight into why the Mississippian transformation was so dynamic and why it spread so rapidly throughout the southeast. On July 23rd, De Soto and his men resumed their march. They reached the village of Visela, which must have been a small place because they continued on it beyond it to Biuvac, probably in the vicinity of present-day Nobleton or East Tachata. The next day, July 24th, they came to Tocaste, located beside a large lake. They were at this time near present-day Floro City, which lay on the southwestern edge of the cove of the Huitlacuchi, a wetland comprising Lake Apopka and its associated swamps in the 16th century. The cove of the Huitlacuchi measured about 25 miles from north to south and was about 6 miles wide. The depth of the water in this wetland varied from a few inches in parts of the swamps to several feet in the channel of the Huitlacuchi River. In 1539, the cove of the Huitlacuchi was far different from what it is today. At that time, over half of all of the land in Florida was covered in forested wetland, but draining, clearing, and filling has reduced this area until today, only about 10% of Florida is in forested wasteland. Remnants of the swamp forest in the cove can be seen today, but in 1539, these strands of cypress were vast and the trees were very tall. Other trees in these swamps were Atlantic white cedar, cabbage palm, dwarf palmetto, slash pine, black gum, water tupelo, coastal plain willow, and several oaks. On the forest floor, there were many shrubs, often with evergreen leaves such as wax myrtle and yaupon holly. And everywhere there were vines, the most common being thorny bamboo vine and poison ivy. These swamps were no doubt full of birds, limpkins, wildebeests, many kinds of herons, wild turkeys, and now rare wood storks. The same day they reached Tocaste, where they established camp, De Soto continued on, leading a detachment of 11 or so horsemen, including Rodrigo Rangel. De Soto knew that they were not far from Ocala, and he wanted to press on, expecting to find riches there. After he and his men had traveled for some distance, they came to a place where the trail widened appreciably. Thinking this must indicate a populous society ahead, De Soto ordered Rodrigo Rangel to ride back to camp with the order to send reinforcements forward. Rangel saw the danger to himself in this assignment, but he bowed his head and submitted, refusing to stoop to asking for others to go along with him. As he backtracked, he did in fact encounter hostile Indians who were following along after De Soto and his contingent of horsemen, but he managed to reach camp safely, and then he made the return journey with 14 additional horsemen, which raised De Soto's total contingent to 26. For all of this to have occurred in the course of a single day means De Soto could not have traveled far beyond where the main part of the army had bivouacked. On July 25th, the main part of the army began moving forward to catch up with De Soto, but the two horsemen bearing a message intercepted them, telling Luis de Moscoso, the master of the camp, to return to the place where they had bivouacked the previous night. The two horsemen and De Soto and his men had a skirmish with hostile Indians. Several Spaniards had been wounded, and a horse belonging to Carlos Enriquez had been killed. The news of the skirmish must have been distressing because the Spaniards were beginning to suffer for want of food. They had become so desperate that when they chanced upon any little field of corn, they would pull the immature green ears from these stalks and wolf them down, cobs and all. The next day, July 26, De Soto found the trail to be wider, and the nature of the terrain improved. This may have been the day when De Soto and his men came to a village whose people had fled, but they spied several of the inhabitants in dugout canoes in a shallow swamp. Ortiz persuaded one of them to come ashore and serve as a guide. De Soto sent Gonzalo Silvestre back to the main body of the army with an order for 30 additional horsemen to be sent forward to join him. The remainder of the army was to resume moving forward. De Soto asked that some biscuits and cheese be sent to him with the detachment of horsemen. Silvestre was to accomplish this mission and be back by the following night. De Soto told Silvestre that he could select one other horseman to go with him. Silvestre chose Juan Lopez Cacho, one of De Soto's pages, who was reluctant to go, but who nonetheless mounted his horse and rode away with Silvestre. Because it was late in the day when they started out, Silvestre and Cacho had to travel much of the way through darkness. They had to retrace precisely the same difficult trail by which they had come, and once daylight had faded, they had to depend upon the ability of their horses to stay on the trail. In sniffing their way, the horses gave out such snorts, Silvestre and Cacho were afraid the Indians would hear them. Finally, they gave their horses full rein. Silvestre was confident that his own horse, a dark chestnut, was superior to Cacho's toasted bay. The two young men, both under 20 years old, were famished from having eaten so little food during the past 2 days, and they were very tired. In several places along the way, they saw Indians dancing by the lights of their fires. But even though the Indians' dogs sensed the Spaniards and began barking, the Indians, perhaps assuming that no Spaniards could be moving about at night, paid them no heed. Later, Cacho became so exhausted he told Silvestre that they had to stop for a while so he could rest. Either that, or else Silvestre should lance him to death on the spot. Silvestre insisted they had to press on and cover as much distance as possible, but Cacho could go no further. He fell from his horse onto the ground as if he were dead. Silvestre remained on his own horse, holding Cacho's horse by the bridle. A very hard rain fell during the night, but it did not waken Cacho. Finally, quite suddenly, the rain ceased, the clouds dispersed, and it quickly became light. Day came so abruptly that Silvestre realized he himself must have fallen asleep in the saddle. He called out to Cacho, who failed to stir, and he had to prod him with the butt of his lance to wake him. Now in the light of day they again moved forward, riding at half speed. The Indians quickly spotted them and set up a great noise, shouting, beating drums, and trumpeting on conch shells, and whenever other Indians heard this alarm, they too set up a clamor. The two riders saw so many canoes moving through the reeds, it was as if the leaves that had fallen in the water had been transformed into canoes. The Indians were not only hostile, they were angry because the two men had succeeded in traveling so far undetected. The Indians in the canoes were heading toward a deep water crossing where they would attempt to intercept the two horsemen. But the two pressed forward through the danger, and even though a shower of arrows rained down on them, neither was wounded. Now they were nearing the camp, and when the soldiers heard the Indians shouting, a large party of horsemen led by Nuño de Tovar rushed out to assist Silvestre and Cacho. As the two came onto higher ground, the Indians were in hot pursuit. But when the warriors saw the horsemen, they turned on their heels and fled back to the safety of the swamp. Following orders delivered by Silvestre, Luis de Moscoso selected 30 lancers to go forward under the leadership of Nuño de Tovar, along with 2 mules loaded with a supply of biscuits and cheese. Silvestre had time to eat only a couple mouthfuls of boiled, half-ripe corn and a small amount of cheese. Less than an hour after he arrived, he set out with the lancers. Cacho, however, remained behind, saying, "The general did not order me either to come here or to return." This force of horsemen was large enough to intimidate the Indians, and not a hand was raised against them along the way. They did not reach the location from which Silvestre had departed until 2 hours after nightfall. Upon arriving, they found that De Soto had already moved forward. Not knowing where he had gone, they could travel no farther. Fearing an attack, they organized a watch and spent an anxious night at the abandoned camp. When daylight came, they were able to see the trail De Soto had taken, and they moved forward to join him. Because in places they had to travel through water up to their chests, they were afraid they would be attacked by Indians in canoes. They were only armed with lances, no crossbows or arquebuses with which to hold the Indians at bay. In swamps, this made them especially vulnerable to arrows. But no attack was made, and they caught up with De Soto without incident. The swamp of Ocale. On this same day, July 26th, the day of St. Anne, De Soto and his contingent of horsemen entered the swamp of Ocale, the cove of the Withlacoochee. The location of the place where they crossed the Withlacoochee River may have been on a trail that lay near present-day Turner Camp Road, which runs from Inverness northeasterly across the cove. Why they chose to take this difficult crossing of the Withlacoochee River is not clear. They could have evaded it by crossing into the territory of Uriparcochi, southeast of the cove of the Withlacoochee, or they could have continued skirting the western side of the cove to the about present-day Dunolan, where the Withlacoochee River was relatively free of swamp. Perhaps De Soto was impatient to reach Ocale, or perhaps their Indian guide deliberately led them into difficult terrain. In any case, those who made the crossing still remembered it vividly many years later. As De Soto and his men made their way into the swamp, small parties of Indians would rush out from concealment, fire arrows at the Spaniards, and then melt back into the cover of trees and bushes. The Spaniards did, however, succeed in capturing a few of them, whom they coerced into serving as guides. But whether through necessity or malice, these guides led De Soto and his men into difficult crossings and into ambushes. De Soto suspected malice, and he threw 4 of them to the dogs. One of the Indian captives, seeing his comrades killed and devoured, and fearing a similar fate, led them to a good clear trail. They followed it to a place where they could wade an expanse of swamp, where the water came only to their chests, and this led to a place where the Withlacoochee River could be crossed. Some were of the opinion that it was the same place where Panfilo de Narvaez and his army crossed the Withlacoochee in 1528, but in fact, Narvaez's crossing may have been closer to the Gulf Coast. In places in this swamp, they would step out onto what appeared to be solid land, but it would tremble and shake for a radius of 20 or 30 feet, and sometimes they would plunge through this land into the water and mud underneath. What they were walking upon were thick floating masses of peat with plants growing on top. De Soto and his advance guard constructed a footbridge across the channel of the Withlacoochee River by taking advantage of a fallen tree that had already spanned it. They built a footbridge across a portion of the stream that this tree did not span. De Soto ordered Pedro Moron and Diego de Oliva, mestizos from Cuba, to go out with axes and chop away some limbs of the tree to make their passage across it more convenient. But as they were at work, some Indians who had been hiding in the reeds near the opposite bank rushed out in a fury and fired arrows at them. Both men dove into the water and swam back, staying underwater as much as possible. They were only slightly wounded because the arrows were slowed by the water. After this minor ambush, the resistance of the people of Ocala faded away. Upstream from the bridge, they found a place where they could get their horses across. At this spot, the Withlacoochee River was broad. More than 3 crossbow shots, más de 3 tiros de ballesta, from side to side. And the current was swift, but it was a place where the river could be forded. Some of the men crossed by wading, though in places the water came up to their necks. They held their clothes and saddles on top of their heads, and they used a rope and tackle to help the horses swim the swift current. When Nuño de Tovar arrived with his 30 horsemen on the following day, he first attempted to swim his horses across the river. But the first one he drove in drowned, and after that, they resorted to using a rope and tackle to pull the horses across. De Soto again sent 2 horsemen back to tell Luis de Moscoso and the others to hurry forward because they had a long way to travel, and there was little food to be had along the way. Commanding a contingent of over 50 horsemen, De Soto set out in search of Ocala. The first village of Ocala they came upon to, Uqueten, was abandoned by its people, but nearby they captured 2 Indians who were spying on them. They found some supplies of corn and beans, as well as some little dogs. Tovar and his men found De Soto encamped among the lush cornfields, some stalks bearing 3 or 4 ears, which they snatched off and ate green while still on horseback. De Soto explained to those who caught up with him that he had moved forward because his men were starving, and for all he knew, his messengers Silvestre and Cacho had been killed by Indians. De Soto sent some horsemen back with mules loaded with corn and other provisions to supply Moscoso and the rest of the army. This came to a welcome relief to Moscoso and his comrades, who were making their way through the swamp with hostile Indians hounding them. Some of the Spaniards who chanced to stray away from the main body of the army had been wounded, and a crossbowman named Mendoza had been killed. They were reduced to eating wild greens, bredos, which they stewed, and roots, which they roasted and risked eating, although they did not know whether they were poisonous. When they reached the vicinity of the Withlacoochee River, they were able to eat cabbage palmetto, which reminded them of the low palm trees growing in Andalusia. They were much relieved to receive the food sent by De Soto and to learn that ample corn was available in Ocala. The principal towns of Ocala lay on the eastern side of the Withlacoochee River, clearly occupying the land that was good for raising corn. Perhaps their principal towns were located on the small island of fertile soils from about Gumslough up to Ross Prairie and westward towards Dunellen. The archaeological culture of Ocala appears to be similar to that of the Safety Harbor culture found in the cove of the Withlacoochee River and around Tampa Bay. De Soto sent an Indian they had captured to the chief of Ocala to ask him and his people to come out of hiding, threatening reprisals if they did not show themselves. The chief sent back a reply, whose words were no doubt different from those reported by Elvas, though the sense may have been the same. I have long since learned of who you Castilians are, through others of you who came years ago to my land, i.e. Pánfilo de Narvaez, and I already know very well what your customs and behavior are like. To me, you are professional vagabonds who wander from place to place, gaining your livelihood by robbing, sacking, and murdering people who have given you no offense. I want no manner of friendship or peace with people such as you, but instead prefer mortal and perpetual enmity. Granted that you are as valiant as you boast of being, I have no fear of you, since neither I nor my vassals consider ourselves inferior to you in valor. And to prove our gallantry, I promise to maintain war upon you so long as you wish to remain in my province, not by fighting in the open, although I could do so, but by ambushing and waylaying you whenever you are off guard. I therefore notify and advise you to protect yourselves and act cautiously with me and my people, for I have commanded my vassals to bring me 2 Christian heads weekly, this number and no more. I shall be content to behead only 2 of you each week, since I thus can slay all of you within a few years. For even though De Soto leads a contingent northward. The Indians the Spaniards captured at Ocala told the Spaniards about Apalachee, a very large province abounding in corn, which lay 7 days' travel away. All of the Indians they met were in awe of the Apalachees, though their impressions and expectations of such distant places exceeded their direct experience. In fact, none of the men they had captured could serve as guides beyond 2 leagues from where they had been captured. On August 11th, De Soto sent forth from Ocala in search of Apalachee with 50 horsemen and 100 footmen. He ordered Luis de Moscoso to remain at Ocala with the remainder of the army. Here they could be sure of having at least a meager supply of food. By the end of the first day of travel, De Soto and his contingent came to Itawarholada, a small village with a plentiful supply of corn. It was located somewhere west of present-day Ocala, probably along the trail that led north through present-day Cotton Plant to Wetumpka Hammock and Lake Orange. As they traveled northward, beneath a canopied forest of huge hardwoods and pines, the foliage was so clear beneath the vaulted trees they could safely gallop their horses. They were relieved to have entered country that was less swampy and marshy than that which they had just traversed. The farther from the sea they traveled, it seemed to them, the more fertile and populous was the land. The next day, August 12th, they came to Potano, where they spent the night. This town was possibly located on the western side of Orange Lake. Potano appears to have possessed a considerable power or influence over other populations living in the surrounding region. In the late 16th century, Spaniards in Florida used the name Potano to refer to all the Indians living in present-day Alachua County. Itawarholada, Potano, and other towns head up to about the Santa Fe River embodied the Alachua archaeological culture. Alachua sites appeared to be concentrated in a narrow band of fertile soils that run from about Lake Weir northward through present-day Ocala, Orange Lake, and Gainesville to the Santa Fe River. People of the Alachua culture almost always built their villages on high ground near lakes or ponds. Their houses were of flex construction, built of poles inserted in the ground and then bent over to form a dome-shaped roof, and the circular floors averaged 7.6 meters in diameter. A fire pit inside was used for heat, lighting, and cooking. Sleeping platforms were raised up on posts around the inside walls of the houses. Their pottery was sand-tempered, with the surface of the vessels scratched or impressed with corn cobs. In addition to the foods they cultivated, they caught a variety of small fish, catfish, bluegill, bream, and sunfish, probably using nets. They principally hunted deer, but also opossum, rabbit, raccoon, muskrat, squirrel, and bear. They also collected palm berries, acorns, and hickory nuts. They built small burial mounds, interring certain of their dead beneath the mounds and also in the eastern slopes of the mounds, so that with several such burials, the mounds gradually became oval in shape. On August 13th, De Soto and his men reached Utina Mochara, a village located in the vicinity of present-day Gainesville, and then they continued on to a town near present-day Alachua, which they named Pueblo de la Malapaz, the village of bad peace, because of an incident that happened there. The incident came after the course of the day's travel, during which Juan de Añasco had captured about 30 Indian men and women. That night, an Indian man came to him in peace, saying he was the chief, and if his people were released, he would make peace and serve the Spaniards well, providing them with food and guides. De Soto released these slaves and put a close guard over the man who claimed to be chief. On the morning of the next day, August 14th, many armed Indian men were seen to come near the town, where they took up positions in the woods. The presumed chief asked to be taken near them, so he could speak to them and assure them that everything was all right. He told the Spaniards that the Indians would do whatever he ordered them to do. But when several Spaniards took the man who pretended to be the chief to his armed comrades, he suddenly attacked his guards and ran away. Other Indians joined him, and they all ran to a densely wooded hill. But De Soto ordered that they loose Bruto, an Irish greyhound, Liberal de Irlanda, already accustomed to the Indians' ascent. The dog ran past several of the fleeing Indians. He seized the pretended chief by the fleshy part of his arm, throwing him into the ground and holding him until the Spaniards came up and captured him. Bruto was one of the Spaniards' principal war dogs, and the Indians soon came to know and fear him. The next day, August 15th, De Soto and his men arrived at Cholupaja, which had such an abundance of corn they named it Villafarta, City of Plenty. It was also at this place where they acquired a quantity of delicious dried small chestnuts, which grew on low bushes rather than on the large trees with which the Spaniards were familiar. This was the Florida chincapin, a dwarf chestnut that grows in northern Florida. Cholupaja was probably located in present-day northern Alachua County, near the Robinson Sinks area. Cholupaja lay near the Santa Fe River. This is normally a small river, and except when the water is high, there is a natural bridge in the vicinity of their crossing place. That is, when the water in the river is low, it flows underground for a distance before emerging from the ground again. But on August 16, 1540, the waters of the Santa Fe must have been swollen and the bridge underwater because they had to spend the entire day building a bridge to cross it. And they spent all of the next day getting across the river, describing their crossing as being as difficult as their crossing of the Huitlacuchi. Some of the men may have begun arguing at this time about whether they should abort the expedition and return to Tampa Bay. In any case, because of an unspecified the battle at Napatoca. At first, De Soto may not have realized how important the chief of Aguacalecan was. 7 chiefs from the area through which they were traveling came to the outskirts of Napatoca and told De Soto they were subjects of the chief of Usachile. Their chief had ordered them to come to the Spaniards with an offer of friendship. They said they were willing to join forces with the Spaniards in waging war against the Apalaches, who were their enemies. Perhaps in exchange for this promise of alliance, they asked De Soto to free the chief of Aguacalecan. De Soto replied that he was not holding the chief as a prisoner. He merely wanted him to accompany his army as far as Usachile. The Indians indicated that they wished to return at a later time to discuss the matter further. They said they would not wish, however, to come into the Spanish camp for fear they themselves would be taken prisoner. De Soto agreed to meet with them on a small plain nearby and promised to bring along only a small number of soldiers. He also promised to bring the chief of Aguacalecan to the meeting. As the Spaniards would later learn, the chief of Napatoca was plotting in all of this a surprise attack. At one point, the chief took aside 4 of the Indian interpreters who were traveling with De Soto and told them of his plan. He said the Spaniards foolishly thought that he, Napatoca, and his allies were their friends, and the Spaniards were thereby becoming careless. When De Soto came out to the plain to meet the chiefs, a surprise attack would be launched against him and all these Spaniards. According to the plan, a dozen men were to seize De Soto and carry him bodily into the midst of the warriors, who would kill him. Other warriors would hurl themselves against the Spanish soldiers, who, being unprepared, would be easily killed or captured. The chief of Napatoca planned to use all the modes of execution the Spaniards had found so amusing. Some Spaniards he would roast, others he would boil, some he would bury, with just their heads remaining above the ground. Some he would poison, so they could see their flesh decay and decompose. Some he would hang by their feet from trees, where birds would eat them. He asked the interpreters to tell him what they thought of his plan, and he asked them to guard his secret. Later, if they wished to remain in his land, they would be honored and would be given beautiful wives. But if they wished to return to their own lands, they could do so, and he could provide a guard for them as they made their way home. They had, after all, been brought forcibly away from their homes by the Spaniards, and now, being so far from home, they would be unable to return through the lands of their enemies. Now, he said, was the time to repulse these Spaniards, who, if unopposed, would deprive them of their lands and women, would take away their liberties, and impose tribute payments upon them. The four interpreters assured the chief of Napatoca that his plan was a good one, but later, when they had time to reflect on it, they realized it probably would not work. They had never seen the Spaniards so poorly disciplined that they could be taken by surprise, nor were the Spaniards easy to deceive. If the interpreters participated in this venture and it failed, they would surely be executed. With these thoughts, they informed Juan Ortiz of the planned attack, and Ortiz immediately went to De Soto with the news. De Soto informed his captains, telling them they should be vigilant but give the appearance of being careless. On the day on which the meeting was to take place, De Soto ordered his men to make ready for combat, but to do so secretly. His horsemen were mounted and made ready, concealing their horses among the houses in which they were quartered. The attack was to begin when a trumpet sounded. On the appointed day, an estimated 400 Indians armed with bows and arrows were seen to come and take up positions in a woods within sight of the camp. 2 Indian men came to the camp and asked De Soto to release the chief of Aguacalecan. De Soto, perhaps seeming to comply, took the chief by the hand and walked along with him, talking all the while to put the Indians at ease. Only 6 footmen accompanied him. De Soto took a saddle along with him to serve as a stool, but no sooner did he sit down on it than the Indians poured out of the woods from many directions. Some were magnificently dressed, wearing tall feather head dresses. As it often happened, De Soto had placed himself in grave danger. Even before the note from the trumpet sounded, Luis de Moscoso whipped his horse, shouting the battle cry, "Come on, knights! Santiago, Santiago, at them!" The horsemen raced down to the small plain, lancing Indians as they rode. For a time the Indians fought valiantly, but faced with the dreaded lancers they took to their heels. De Soto mounted his favorite horse, Aceituno, but the Indians took careful aim, striking Aceituno with several arrows in the chest, in the knees, and on both sides, and he fell as if he had been hit by a cannonball. The horsemen swept down to where De Soto had fallen, giving him protection. One of De Soto's pages, Viota from Zamora, dismounted and gave De Soto his own horse to ride. 30 or 40 Indians were lanced during the fighting. Others fled to the safety of a nearby forest. The rest of them fled to 2 lakes that were close by each other. Diving in, they swam out to some distance from the shore, where they stayed out of the reach of the Spaniards, treading water. The water in these lakes was more than a head deep at only a short distance from shore, which means they were probably lime sinks, numerous in the karst topography of this part of Florida. One of the sinks was small enough for the Spaniards to surround completely. The other was too large to be surrounded. The arquebusiers and crossbowmen shot at the swimming Indians, but they were at too great a distance from shore to be harmed. While their strength lasted, the Indians managed to shoot back. 3 or 4 Indians would lift an archer up out of the water, who would shoot several arrows at the Spaniards, though to no effect. As darkness grew near, De Soto ordered his horsemen and footmen to keep guard all the way around the smaller of the 2 lakes. Some or all of the Indians in the larger lake may have escaped under the cover of darkness. The Indians in the smaller lake also tried to escape by putting lily pads on their heads and swimming silently toward shore. But when the Spanish soldiers saw the pads moving, they would dash into the water with their horses until they were chest deep, driving the Indians back out to the lake. Juan Ortiz shouted to the swimmers in the lake, telling them that escape was impossible and they should surrender. As the night went on, the swimmers suffered more and more from fatigue and from the cold water. By midnight, they had been in the water for about 14 hours. One by one, they began to surrender, approaching the shore and shouting to Juan Ortiz that they were giving up. By daybreak, all had surrendered except 12 of the principal men. De Soto sent the Indians, to whom they had enslaved at Uriparcochi, who now went about unchained, to swim out into the lake and bring in the remaining ones. These Indian slaves did as they were ordered, pulling the half-drowned men to shore by their hair. The last remaining Indian in the lake was the chief of Uriutina, who was finally pulled out by some Indians of Usachile. When he came ashore, he asked for a messenger to be sent back to his people bearing the following message, interpreted by Juan Ortiz. Look, you, go to my people and tell them that they take no thought of me, that I have done as a brave man and lord what there was to do, and struggled and fought like a man until I was left alone. And if I took refuge in this lake, it was not to escape death, or to avoid dying as befits me, but to encourage those that were there and had not surrendered. I did not give myself up until these Indians of Usachile, which are of our nation, asked me to, saying that it would be best for all. Wherefore, what I enjoin upon them and ask is this, that they do not, out of regard for me or for anyone else, have anything to do with these Christians who are devils and will prove mightier than they, and that they may be assured that as for me, if I have to die, it will be as a brave man. All told, the Spaniards took as many as 300 Indian prisoners from the lake. Among these were 5 or 6 chiefs, including the chief of Uriutina. The Spaniards tied the hands of the prisoners behind their backs and put them into a building in the town of Napatoca. The next day, the bulk of the prisoners, the ones who were commoners, were divided up among the Spaniards to be their slaves. As for the chiefs, De Soto went among them and talked to them, trying to persuade them to accept his friendship. He ordered that they be released from their bonds and treated with civility. But the captives were not interested in peace. They had agreed among themselves that should an opportunity present itself, they would rise up in revolt. When De Soto released the chiefs from their chains, one of them, perhaps the architect of the revolt, turned his body from one side to the other, extended his arms with his fists clenched, and then brought his fists back to his shoulders. Then he shook his arms once or twice with enough force to make his joints crack. This was a gesture the Indians of the southeast commonly performed when they were about to undertake something that required strength. This man then sprang over to where De Soto was sitting, grabbed him by the collar, and with a loud shout struck him a ferocious blow in the face. De Soto toppled backward, chair and all, and landed on his back unconscious. The chief then fell upon him, trying to kill him with his bare hands, but De Soto's guards drew their swords and killed him. The chief's shout had been a signal for all the Indian prisoners to rise up in revolt. They grabbed whatever was close at hand, whether a sword, a burning firebrand, or a pot of hot food, and tried to kill those Spaniards who stood nearest. One Indian felled his master with a club, and then commenced to beat him with his fist until his face was swollen. When the fallen man's comrades came to his aid, the Indian seized a lance that was propped against a wall and climbed up into a corn crib, shouting so loudly it sounded as if 10 men were inside. He defended the door of the corn crib in such a way that none...
Anaika, principal town of Apalachee. On September 23rd, De Soto and his army departed from Napatoca and traveled to the Suwannee River, probably coming to it in the vicinity of present-day Dowling Park. They called the Suwannee River the River of the Deer because messengers from Usachile met them at this point bearing a gift of deer meat. This was noteworthy because throughout the entire expedition they seldom ate deer meat, but for some reason deer abounded in this area. In spite of this gift, the people of Usachile were not kindly disposed toward the Spaniards. When De Soto and his men went to look at the river with its steep limestone banks, a great number of warriors appeared on the opposite side of the river, shouting and firing arrows at the Spaniards. They shouted, according to Garcilasco, "So you thieves, vagabonds, and foreign immigrants want a bridge. You will not see it built with our hands." Because of the great width of the river, their arrows did little damage. However, the war dog Bruto escaped from one of De Soto's pages, who was holding him on a leash. Bruto plunged into the river and began swimming over to attack the Indians on the opposite side. The Spaniards called for him to return, but he would not. The Indians began shouting at him, their arrows striking him in the head and back, delivering mortal wounds. He reached the opposite bank before he died, and the Indians no doubt rejoiced at his death. The Spaniards, on the other hand, were distressed over the loss of a dog who had been so effective against the Indians. A bridge had to be built to cross the Suwannee. When its framework was ready to be placed in the river, De Soto built several rafts and sent a contingent of arquebusiers, crossbowmen, and horsemen across to secure the other side. The horsemen's mounts were driven into the river and made to swim across. With the opposite side of the bank thus secured, they completed construction of the bridge, which was 3 tall pine trees long and 4 wide. The entire army made it across to the other side on September 25th. On the same day, traveling through level, clear land, skirting around the northern end of San Pedro Bay, they passed through 2 small villages and one very large one named Apalu, and came by nightfall to the main town of Uzachile, probably in the general vicinity of Sampala Lake. The main town of Uzachile had been abandoned by its people, who must have had full knowledge of the occurrences at Napatoca. They were hiding out in the surrounding countryside. The Spaniards remained in this place for 3 days, commandeering an abundance of corn, beans, and pumpkins. The pumpkins were said to be tastier than those that were grown in Spain. Small parts of Uzachile warriors began attacking the Spaniards, guerrilla fashion. With this, the Spaniards began killing Indians whenever they found them, sparing very few. After a time, De Soto sent out 2 slaving parties in different directions, who captured about 100 men and women of Uzachile. On September 29th, they continued traveling, passing through a woods of very small trees, coming at nightfall to a pine woods, where they bivouacked. Without obtaining De Soto's permission, a boy named Cadena left camp and backtracked to retrieve a sword that had been lost. When he returned, De Soto threatened to hang him for leaving the army without permission. The boy's life was saved only through the good words of some who intervened on his behalf. On September 30th, they came to Asile, the first town subject to Apalachee, and the people there were taken completely by surprise. Their having no forewarning that De Soto was coming was a sure sign they were not in amity with the people of Uzachile. When De Soto and his men approached, the people of Asile fled to the surrounding woods, but the Spaniards succeeded in capturing some women. Asile was probably located on the eastern side of the Alafia River, in the southwestern corner of Madison County. Immediately upon entering the territory of the chiefdom of Apalachee, the Spaniards realized they were up against a military force that was more organized than any they had seen up to this point. Indians all along the way had warned the Spaniards about the fierceness of the Apalachees. Even the women were tough. This was brought home to a young soldier named Herrera, who lagged behind his comrades with a woman of Asile. Herrera probably tried to assault the woman sexually, but she grabbed him by his genitals and had him at her mercy, and might have done him great damage had he not yelled and been rescued by his comrades. On October 1st, they departed from Asile and soon arrived at the river and swamp of Ivitachuco, the Alafia River and its adjacent floodplain. The point at which they came to the swamp and river was a few miles southeast of present-day Lamont. The channel of the Alafia River was not wide, but it was too deep to be forded. On both sides of the river lay broad back swamps with shallow water, and bordering both back swamps was a dense jungle of tall trees with vines and undergrowth of cane so dense that from a distance it looked like a solid wall. The Indians had cut a footpath just wide enough for a single person, or at most 2 abreast, to pass through this morass of foliage, water, and mud. As the Spaniards made their way through the back swamp on the eastern side, with water coming up to their tights and waists, the Apalachees contested every inch of their progress. The Spaniards used their hatchets and axes to widen the trail as they passed along it. By the end of the day, on October 1st, they had reconnoitered the swamp and were in a position to pass on to the channel of the river. They spent an anxious night because of the threat of the Apalachees. 2 hours before dawn of the next day, De Soto roused his men and moved silently toward the river. The Apalachees had not expected them to be up and about while it was still dark, and they had relaxed their vigilance. When they heard the Spaniards moving about, the Indians rushed toward the place where they intended to cross, shouting in a fury. But the Spaniards were ready and met them blow for blow, shot for shot. The Spaniards built a crude bridge across the river near a tree that lay across the channel. the army began crossing to the other side on October 2nd. The night of October 2nd was spent in the swamp in an area as they laboriously cleared. None of the Spaniards slept at night because the Indians whooped and created diversions to upset them. De Soto and his men were aware that this was the same swamp through which Narvaez had crossed with such difficulty years earlier, and perhaps the Appalachians had learned a thing or two about tactics from their encounter with Narvaez. At daybreak, the Spaniards continued their crossing of the river and swamp, finding on the western side another back swamp with another very narrow footpath, and still the Appalachians kept up their resistance. With their horsemen useless, the Spanish footmen had to push the Indians back a little at a time. Arrows flew at the Spaniards from both sides. In the time it took a crossbowman or arquebusier to reload his weapon, an Appalachian was able to fire 6 or 7 arrows. An arrow had hardly hit its target before another was knocked in the bowstring. When the forest finally opened up, the Spaniards found that the Appalachians had built barriers against the horses by tying poles horizontally to the trees. But once the Spaniards got past these barriers, they took the offensive with their horsemen, lancing the Indians without mercy. When they reached the first cornfields of Appalachia, they continued to ride down and lance to death any Appalachian they encountered, particularly those who made any show of resistance. All the army had succeeded in making the crossing by noon, October 3rd. Their only loss was a horse, which drowned while crossing the river. By nightfall, they had reached the town of Ivitachuco, which the Appalachians had set afire. The town was probably located near Lake Iamonia. Evidently, they rested in Ivitachuco on October 4th. Throughout the night, the Appalachians shouted and fired arrows into the camp. The next day, the army traveled in a northwesterly direction. Following a trail that lay near present-day Highway 27 or State Road 36, they passed through fields of corn and vegetables as far as the eye could see, with many houses scattered about. They passed near Lake Catherine and Lake Waukena before coming to a small entrenched stream, probably Burnt Mill Creek, where the Appalachians put up a particularly stiff resistance. In the dense floodplain vegetation that grew along this stream, the Indians had constructed fences and barricades against the horses. The Spaniards had to fight their way to the other side on foot until they can cut through the barricades. The Appalachians fought with great desperation. This was their last hope of stopping the Spaniards, and they failed. By the end of the day on October 5th, De Soto and his men reached the village of Calauchi, possibly on the St. Marks River, southeast of present-day Cheres. Here they captured 2 men and a woman, and they found a large quantity of dried deer meat. On this same day, the guide who had brought them this far had escaped and ran away. The next day, October 6th, they got nowhere at first, following a new guide, an old man who led them at random. Then an Indian woman led them to Anhaica, the principal town of the chiefdom of Appalachia. Anhaica was located within the present-day city of Tallahassee. All the people of Appalachia had fled from this and all the other towns, seeking refuge in these swamps. Luis Hernandez de Biedma estimated the distance from the landing point at Tampa Bay to Anhaica to have been 110 leagues. The actual distance is about 320 miles. This concludes Chapter 4.